thankful to have Wei Shin Lei with us. She filling in for Bruce this morning. And Bruce is in dress rehearsals for a play that's coming up. And I'm very thankful for her sharing her talents with us. Thank you, Janet, for reading. Thank you, Carolyn. Thank you, Carolyn, for sharing this morning, and for all of you that have shared testimonies during this Looking for Love. It's just been wonderful to hear from the midst of your lives how you find love and how you share love. The Lord is our shepherd, which of course for most of us, most of the time, just brings such wonderful feelings of security and serenity, looking to God as our shepherd. But that's with the benefit of hundreds of years of reading this passage. At the time that it was written, I don't know that it would have been that way so much. During that time, there was very much a mama, don't let your children grow up to be shepherd vibe at the time. From ancient writings around the same time as the Bible, Abba Gurion of Tzaydin says, in the name of Abba Guria, a person may not teach his son the trades of a donkey driver, a camel driver, a pot maker, a sailor, a shepherd, or a storekeeper. The reasons for all these is the same, is their trades are the trades of robbers. One may not purchase wool, milk, and kids from the shepherds who tend the flocks of others, due to the concern that they have stolen these items from the owners of the flocks. The occupation of shepherd was not a well thought of profession. And yet here in this psalm from Hebrew Scriptures, God is our shepherd. And right after this chapter in John chapter 10, that Janet read from us, John chapter 9, Jesus proclaims himself to be our shepherd, and that the sheep know his voice. Who do we look to shepherd us? Usually, it's not folks like shepherds. It's those that we might put up on a pedestal, those that we look up to. In this story that Janet read from us from the Gospel of John, I think we see that tension there. Jesus is walking with his disciples, and the disciples see a blind man. And of course, the disciples' first response is, well, how can we help this one? Right? Is that what happened? Nope. It engendered a conversation. Jesus, who sinned? This man or his parents? How often do we, when we're confronted with the need of the world, when we're confronted with the need of those right in front of us, turn it into a philosophical or a theological conversation instead of allowing their plight to break us open, and that our hearts might be open to them as God's heart is open to them. But Jesus catches them and says, neither him nor his parents have sinned. This one is blind to show the glory of God. And before we make too much of that, because that would make for a very monstrous God indeed, wouldn't it? I think what Jesus is saying here is that there is power, that there is healing available to this one. I think it's so important to remember when we see these healing stories in the Gospels that it's never just about the physical healing. If that was the case, then one would have been fine. Yes, Jesus can heal the blind. Every time we see a story of healing of blindness in the Gospels, It's an invitation to us to see things in new ways. That's the purpose of these gospel stories of healing of the blind. And so there's this interaction between Jesus and the blind man. And just about every time Jesus heals a blind one in the Gospels, he does it in a different way. This way is a really bizarre way. He makes some mud out of some dirt on the ground and spit, and mixing it together, puts it on the blind man's eyes, and he receives a healing. And then Jesus kind of is out of the picture for a couple of paragraphs, which is really unusual in the Gospel of John. It's just really centered around Jesus. And we see the community's response to the healing of the blind man. And they're confused. They're wondering. And I think that's not too far off from what many of us experience when we've experienced new life, or we've experienced healing, or a new way of seeing things. Sometimes the folks around us are put a little bit off guard by that. I think people get invested in us. Folks get invested in our illnesses, in the way things are. And when healing comes, when new life comes, when new ways of seeing things come, when we're able to get healthy, sometimes the reaction of those around us, those that love us, can be kind of off-putting, because they're used to us being the old way that we were. And so this community comes around the blind man and they say, what's going on? What's happening here? And then the religious leaders of the day come and hear about this one that was healed and start to question the blind man about it. And it's important to remember here, just to take a step back and remember that this gospel was written during a time where there was a people within Judaism that were coming out of Judaism and finding a different path. And so there was a little bit of tension between these two groups that's reflected in the writings. And unfortunately, what has happened over the centuries is we've taken those tensions and sometimes they've led to anti-Semitism, which is tragic. But we want to thread a line and say that this wasn't necessarily just the Jewish people. It was the religious leaders. Religious leaders that could very easily be transferred to the religious leaders of today. And when something happens that's new, when something happens that's life-giving, when people start to realize that they're accepted exactly for who they are, when they start to realize that healing is available to them, that's not necessarily having to come through the institutions of religion, then religious leaders get a little bit nervous and a little upset and question what is happening. And so over and over again, and you can see the wheels turning in their minds. Now, what happened exactly, Mr. Blind Man? He says, well, I was blind, and now I'm able to see. And so their response is, well, no, this person couldn't have done that. He was healing on the Sabbath. He's a sinner. How could he have provided this healing? A question that I just think is fascinating. Because how else does healing take place except through sinners? Sinners like you and sinners like me. And they ask him over and over again. And all the blind man can do is say, well, this is what has happened. And he has a little lip in there too, which I like. He says, why do you want to know? Do you want to be his disciples too? And he says, I don't understand all of this. All I can tell you is this. Once I was blind, but now I can see. That's the testimony. That's the testimony that y'all have been sharing over the past few weeks of the love in your life. We can't explain it all. My goodness, we can't even explain the events of the day. All we know is that we've received love, that we've received acceptance through God, through the presence of one another as we accompany one another on our journey. And we oftentimes realize, don't we, that the healing, that the acceptance, that the help doesn't often come from the halls of power, from the important people. It comes from those that notice the plight that we're in and come alongside and help. It doesn't come from the people that we think should be providing that. The folks that run our world. Comes from people like you and like me. People like those in this video of the sheep run that we were seeing that so often might be discounted by those who we think are important, but are, as is said over and over again, the salt of the earth. How do we recognize those that we want to lead us? We had the experience yesterday, some of us, of marching with the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. The Coalition of Immokalee Workers was started back in 1993 by Immokalee workers. They saw that the price that they were getting paid to pick tomatoes was dropping and dropping and dropping while everything else was going up. They heard the stories from the fields of terrible abuse, verbal, physical, sexual abuse. And they said, well, you know what? Nobody else is going to do anything about this. We need to do something about this. And so they themselves started this coalition, started making their story known to others. And it took years and years and years in the midst of still doing the work that they needed to do. And finally, people started listening. And people joined them in the fight. People that allowed the coalition to lead, to shepherd them in bringing about change in this environment and in this world. I can't wait to see how else we might be led by those that we in the past haven't seen as leaders, and how that might bring about to us new ways of seeing, new ways of allowing our eyes to be open, new ways of seeing God's self. As we read these scripture texts, as we read the circumstances from the margins, how might that bring healing in new ways of being? Back in the 1960s, there were two roommates at Columbia University named Sandy and Art. And Sandy, all of a sudden, started to lose his eyesight. And so he had gone to the hospital, and it was diagnosed as something like temporary conjunctivitis, and thought that it would go away. But it didn't go away. And his eyesight continued to deteriorate. Depressed, he left college, went home, locked his door, and didn't want to have anything to do with anyone and didn't know how his life would continue. But his roommate, Art, didn't forget about him. So Art bought a ticket to Buffalo and went to Sandy's house and brought him back to college. And Sandy became Art's eyes on campus, would help Sandy with all of his work, would do the reading for him, would lead him from class to class, stood by his side through those years. One time they were in this Grand Central Station, and all of a sudden Art was by Sandy's side, and then the next moment Art wasn't by Sandy's side. And Sandy had to make his way himself, and he was tripping over things and running into people, and he fell and got a gash on his shin, but he made it to his train, and there he found Art. And Art, apologizing to him, said, "I was behind you all the time." And Sandy points to that moment as maybe one of the greatest gifts that Art had given him, that opportunity to practice his own independence. Sandy ended up graduating, ended up going into law and doing quite well for himself. Started a company called Electronic Data Processing, EDP, and made millions. Before he achieved that success, though, while still at Oxford, he went on to study at Oxford. Sandy got a call from Art. And this time it was Art that needed help. He had formed a folk duo with a high school friend, and they desperately needed $400 to record their first album. And Sandy and his wife, Sue, only had $404 in their bank account, but without hesitation, Sandy gave his old friend what he needed. And Art and Paul's first album wasn't a success at first, until one of the songs, The Sounds of Silence, shot up to number 1 on the pop charts. The opening line, "Hello, darkness, my old friend," echoed the way that Sandy had always greeted Art. Art said, "It's your old friend, darkness." Sandy described himself as the luckiest man in the world. Who do we choose to lead us? Who do we choose to shepherd us? I don't know that we could do much worse than the people that we have typically chosen to shepherd us in society. Maybe it would be good for us to have our eyes opened, to be, if I'm still allowed to say this, awakened to those that would come alongside us to help guide us on our journey, that we might in turn come alongside others, not needing to lead them, but maybe just accompanying them on their journey. Maybe we can walk together to create new ways of seeing and new ways of being. Let's pray together. And as has been our habit over the season of Lent, we are incorporating God have mercy in Greek, Kyrie eleison, in our prayers.